Hello.
Welcome to the show. This is the History Dose Mongol live stream number 2 featuring Jackmeister. We're going to bring him on in a minute. We'll let people trickle in here. Let me add in the presentation. So, we did our recent video on the Mongol origins. This is how the YouTube algorithm works. If you want to see our latest short, How to Train Like a Mongol, this is what's being referred. If you search "Do girls like beards," you'll find it. If you search "History Dose," you have an equal chance of finding it. Or if you search "I Got Meow." So those, why is the video not performing as well as some others? Well, we don't really know. I don't think
We're
YouTube
not
knows.
reaching the right demographic, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, do girls like beards is the question. And
Do they?
maybe,
Because Chris and I are a little different on that matter.
and so is Jackmeister. All right. So the Mongol live stream number 2, our most viewed live stream was the one we did in the fall. Again, I am Chris. I'm the guy who writes and does the research and narrates, and this is my brother Joe, and he does all the art
Hello.
editing and increasingly the music.
Yeah, this last episode was all my original composition, so it makes me feel good when people say, "What's that music? I need to listen to that music."
Real quick, this was one of the paintings Joe did for it. This was the Mongol village. Just a quick plug. We are going to Mongolia in August. This is the homeland of Genghis Khan, nomadic living, and all that good stuff. So, yeah, sleeping in yurts and stuff. I have the link in the description. June 18th is the deadline for that. So you're going to want to make that. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters. The con tier, we have Benissimo. We have the leader tier, Omri. And I have the link to the Patreon. We have bonus content. I have a bonus video for this last video, and all the other tiers. You can sign up for a Patreon. And here's my introduction to the Jackmeister, the best publicly available image of him. Let's bring him on.
Hello,
Hey, welcome.
Jack,
Sandonu.
you got to translate that for us.
That's hello. How are you in Mongolian?
Okay,
Oh,
wonderful.
good thing we know. That's one word that we will now know when we go on our trip.
Say Sanu. That's
Sanu?
the short version of it.
So, Jack, a couple sentences to introduce yourself to somebody who sacrilegiously skipped the first Mongol live stream.
So my name is Jack Wilson, though professionally I am called the Jackmeister Mongol History. I am a historian of the Mongol Empire. I've been producing content online relating to the Mongols since like 2016 or so, but I'm currently in the midst of my PhD. So my PhD research focuses on the Golden Horde in the late 13th century, but for this online work, I work with all aspects of the Mongol Empire, and I work regularly with kings and generals. And with History Dose, now we've done a few of these. Now I don't actually recall how many. Must be
Probably
We did
4,
Baghdad, right?
4 or 5.
Baghdad.
Yeah, be something around there. Yes, and this topic that that they covered this week, the preaching this in Mongolia, is a topic I have been really interested to dig deeper in for a long time now. And over the last couple of months, I had an opportunity to do a lot more of that, and sent some of these notes to Chris, who did an excellent job with Joe, turning that into the introduction you hopefully all watched before this live stream, and will be the first of several parts on the rise of Chinggis Khan and the start of the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, we're working our way back from the beginning.
Wonderful.
Prequel series, as it were.
It is exactly. A prequel. So I wanted to dive into some of the stuff that we saw in the episode, some of the insanely minute details that we applied to this at the gracious help of Jackmeister. And on a similar topic, throughout the show, feel free to ask us questions. We'll probably, we'll keep it loose. We'll be able to answer questions. Anything Mongol related, early Mongol would be sort of on topic, but the Jackmeister is pretty well equipped to handle most of what you guys can throw at him. And yeah, so we'll be diving into the episode, stuff like that. Again, we'll give some priority to super chats. We'll notice you more. You're supporting the channel, but just keep them coming. All right, so let me present this again. Here we go. I'm sorry for that. Okay, so this was one of the really interesting paintings. This is one that I shared with the Jackmeister early on. I'm hoping this works out. Dang, it's not working. Okay, so it's doing a weird thing because I had animations here.
Can't do animations?
It's just showing them all as a, sort of like one thing, but I could also just share my screen here, and we could go through, and then the animations will work. So I'll just do it for this one, but hopefully you guys can see this. You guys seeing this all right?
Yeah, it's coming in.
Okay. So this is one we sent to. This was in the episode. We wanted to show basically a very well-equipped warrior and then a normal Mongol warrior. So on the right side, you have just the common robe and deal that would have been felt, and you're going into battle with your bow and arrow. But on the left side, and Jack, tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly. We have somebody in the Katongu Degal armor.
As I understand, Hatongudel would be the 13th century pronunciation.
Okay, wonderful.
I think a little different in modern Hulk Mongolian, but
and so we can see some of the precise details. So I'll show you the version. This is what we sent to Jack. And if you're like, hey, this looks exactly the same as what I was just saying, no, it doesn't, because I sent this to Jack and he was like, yeah, really good job. But there should be, what were you calling it? Like that, basically like a lining or something, welding.
Yes. The what are they called? The folds or something on the helmet, or the bands on the helmet piece covering where because the helmets are made out of a couple pieces, and you have these bands covering the joins in the helmet for the one style of helmet that they would have been using in the steppe at this time. So our dear friend Joe here, after I gave him quite a list of notes, worked his magic on there. And
yeah, well, because the other things were, then you pointed out the visor. You're like, okay, yeah. Well, the visor doesn't really come out, I think, until the Imperial era, and we're about 1170 here. Mm-hmm. Then you also point out the pauldrons on this specific kind of armor in this era tended to be actually connected rather than disconnected.
Yep.
And then you can't really see it so much, but his foot was a little bit too far down relative to where Mongol saddles tend to sit a bit higher. Yeah. And so this was the final product. Mm-hmm. And you can see
little nose bridge there too.
Yeah. Did anybody notice? Jack did.
There's a lot of comments that were saying like, "Oh yeah, you got that right."
For those 7 seconds. This style of armor generally in this period. This is this Hatongudel. This is a mention that appears in the Secret History of the Mongols, so one of our earliest surviving Mongolian language sources, and it is often understood in modern parlance as a type of armor, but what it literally means is like a coat as hard as steel or something to that effect. And the idea seems to be that this might just be sort of a poetic way to refer to armor, but it's generally we present it as this type of armor today in art and stuff, because this is a very popular type of armor we see in artwork from both the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, but even in the Japanese depictions of the Mongol invasions of Japan in the late 13th century. They're showing this very similar type of armor, and it seems to be, it could be just like a thickly padded coat, or it could have steel or iron plates sewn into it. So these little metal rivets that you see on it that's not armor. That's not offering protection. What those are the rivets holding these steel plates in place. Now, if anyone watching this is familiar with the armors of the Ming and Qing dynasties, the type of armor called dingjia is sort of the successor to this, and this is something that is worn in China basically up until the 20th century, though by that point it's a bit more of a ceremonial thing. So we have a long history of artistic depictions, but even a few surviving like actual historical examples still extant today, which provides us a lot of reference materials for using or for depicting this type of armor.
Yeah, and then so that seam that we also see on this helmet too was directly taken from a archaeological dig picture that you shared with me. So that visor and the specific design is from that, because I believe, were there eventually taller one-piece helmets?
But that's so these taller ones are actually, they post date the Mongol Empire, and these taller helmets are very popular, like by the Jungars, the Kazakhs. It's during the Qing dynasty. It is a design historically used by Mongols, but not in the conquest era helmets. The conquest era helmets that we can see from both the archaeology and some of the artwork are actually tend to be rather short, shallow things, and there's a number of I don't know the exact number, but there are many actual surviving of the helmets or fragments of the helmets, which allow us to see they were actually producing these on a relatively large scale and very consistently. And then as they spread out across Asia in the centuries after the Mongol Empire, these affect local designs of helmets and kind of evolve into different directions. And these taller helmets, that is one direction that they end up going. You have two main styles of helmets among the Mongols in this period. This one here is kind of the classic Central Asian nomad helmet, where it's like four or more pieces held together with these overlapping folds, or a even shallower one-piece helmet, which it looks like the Mongols pick up from their conquest of the Jurchen Qin dynasty in North China. And it also has these lovely, I don't know if you have a picture in the slideshow here, but it has these lovely eyebrows, like kind of decorative eyebrows on it.
Oh yeah, I don't have that, but
and they evolve into this visor. But you can still see on some of the helmets, the decorative eyebrows are kind of left on there, but a lot fainter. And for some reason, it's sort of this extraneous piece. They thought, yes, that's an important one. We keep on there. I don't know why, but we can see it's being done.
So let me swing back to the actual. Here we go. Yeah, so I wanted to, and throughout the show, we'll be sort of looking at these questions. We have a question from Sean from the Discord, which is just going to be relevant. I know these sources because I was working with them, but Jack can speak more substantively about their origin. So what are the sources for Temujin's early life, and when do we think they were written? So a lot of this seems kind of legendary. I mentioned that in the video. How can we trust what's in here? When was it written down?
Well, Sean, if you're watching, excellent question. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart. So for those watching who don't know, Temujin is the birth name of Genghis Khan. And we actually have a number of materials attesting to his early life. Most of them originate from the Mongol Empire. The first major one is a work called The Secret History of the Mongols. So this is a Mongolian language work written for the Mongol royal family, probably in 1252 by the latest dating, or by sort of more recent arguments, on the orders and compiled on the orders of Chinggis Khan's grandson Menka Khan. We also have things like the no longer extant veritable record, which was a work compiled by another grandson of Chinggis named Kublai Khan during the early years of the Yuan dynasty, originally written probably in the late 1260s. Now, the Mongolian language original does not survive, but we get it surviving through translations into Chinese in the first chapter of the Yuan Share. So this is a German translation done by a friend of mine, German edition done by a friend of mine named Norman Schlimmer, and it is overlapping a lot with the material in The Secret History. And this work also survives in a Persian translation, which is the main section on the life of Chinggis Khan in the writing of Rashid ad-Din and the Jami al-Tawarik, a massive universal history written in the Ilkhanate, in this part of the Mongol Empire ruling the Middle East around 1300. But we also have some outside observer accounts. So our earliest ones are compiled in this nice translation done by Christopher Atwood. Now, what these are mostly are Chinese border officials and envoys who are writing in like 1215, 1230s, like as the Mongol conquests are like starting and the Mongols are taking control of northern China. These guys are reporting the rumors they're hearing, or they are even traveling as embassies to the Mongol courts and hearing things about the early life and establishment of the Mongol Empire and reporting that. And as the Mongol Empire expands, then we have all sorts of Islamic, European, Armenian, and Georgian, all of these accounts saying what they hear about the origins of the Mongol Empire. And there's a really interesting thing where a lot of them are reporting that prior to becoming an emperor, Chinggis Khan was a blacksmith. Now, that seems a little weird at first, but the meaning of his personal name, Temujin, is like man who works with iron, so blacksmith. So Timur, as in Mongolian and Turkic languages, means iron, and then Jin is a personal suffix indicating someone is doing it. So what we have is two main categories of sources made by the Mongols or people working for the Mongols, and then sources from outsiders, hearing maybe from the Mongols or hearing from people being ruled by the Mongols. And we can compile all of these together and get a vague chronology of Chinggis Khan's life. The main problem is most of this stuff is written, or all of this stuff is written after he becomes an emperor. And it's written in such a way to justify his rise to power. And everyone else, even the outsiders, are only learning this information on 12th century Mongolia, filtered through this image of Chinggis Khan's rise to power, which means we can understand the broad strokes of what happened, but some of the details, some of the chronology, it starts to get really fuzzy even between the extant sources. And since all of these are written decades or 100 years after the fact, it makes it very uncertain, a lot of the more precise information. So one of the great issues here is Yesugai, Chinggis Khan's father, who was covered in this video, just released on History Dose, where if you read the Mongol Empire sources, such as The Secret History, Rashid ad-Din, the biography in the Yuan Share, we see Yesugai is like, he's this nobleman, he's a really important guy. He sometimes even has the title of Khan. But then in I I forget which one, but one of our early Chinese observers written outside of the empire, they say Yasugai. They don't even say his name is Yasugai. They give him a different name, and they say he's a commander of 10 men. Now, those are two very different and not really compatible images here, and we don't really have a good solution to that, because it could be this Chinese guy is just wrong and he misheard it, or it could be our Mongol sources are really exaggerating Yesugai's importance to sort of increase Chinggis Khan's legitimacy later on, to go like, look, even his father wasn't an emperor, but his father was still an important guy. And this is the troubles of writing the history of the Mongolian plateau in this period. Is all of the information we have is basically fighting with that struggle.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the details that you see in this video are not things that are specifically said about Yasugai, but they're things that you can read between the lines and figure out. So the fact that Yasugai has to steal his bride, Oilun, or the fact that he has to leave Temujin with the father of Temujin's future wife in order to secure that marriage, gives you an idea that he's probably not Khan. There's probably not a bunch of women and chiefs that are lining up to marry him, or chiefs that want their daughters to marry his son.
The implication seems to be that the realistic Yasugai that we can reconstruct is, okay, he was probably of this noble background, but he was probably a very minor princeling, a bit of a ruffian, kind of a scoundrel who wasn't very wealthy. He wasn't terribly successful, but he made something of a name for himself as a warrior, but not enough to really build up a secure enough following or wealth to pass on to his children securely. And the result of that is that when Yasugai dies in 1170, Temujin and his young family are abandoned. So,
yeah, and I thought it was interesting too, because there's kind of duality there, where they aren't abandoned right away, which gives you some idea that they were considered. So he was of status enough to be considered to stay in the clan, but then eventually they're making the call, yeah, your status isn't there. You know, your widows and your children are not worth keeping around.
There's some sort of political struggle there going on as well, where it's said that the wives of Ambakai Khan, so Ambakai is the Khan who was killed at the start of this last episode, and he is, I forget now, he would have been like the great uncle or something of Yasugai. And it seems, at least in the account we're getting from the Mongol imperial sources, that Ambagai's widows are taking shelter with Yasugai, or they're at least spending some amount of time together, and that after Yasugai's death, these widows of Ambakai are kind of like pulling some strings to get Yasugai's widows and children, to get them kicked out of the scene, perhaps for their own kind of plans, who they wanted the succession to go to. It's not really clear, because the widows, as far as I know, stopped getting mentioned after that point. So it's hard to say what the long-term plan was. But again, these are the problems we have in the sources. Is this something that actually happened, or is this just the version written after the fact to justify why, to put the blame on someone else?
I'm just highlighting this comment in the chat. I thought this was interesting because he's asking about the original secret history of the Mongols. I seem to recall, like maybe a week ago, you were mentioning that we had recently found, or semi-recently found, another copy of the secret history of the Mongols. Was that in Tibet?
Yes. So what the original secret history of the Mongols, as it was written, or as in the original manuscript written probably in 1252, does not survive. So the main reconstruction is done using a Ming era handbook where the Ming Dynasty wanted to use it as a guidebook to help its officials learn Mongolian for dealing with Mongols. So what you have is the Mongolian written phonetically in Chinese characters and then a Chinese translation of that. Now, the earliest ones of that survive date from 1404. And we know that exactly. I think they literally have a date on them. They were discovered in the 1930s in the Forbidden City in Beijing. As well, in the 17th century in Mongolia, they rediscovered a copy in the original vertical Mongolian script, and that was incorporated into some Mongolian chronicles of the time, most famously the Altan Topchi of Lupsendanzen. And more recently, they have found a couple leaves. I don't know quite which sections of the work, but a rather extensive section, as it turns out, in a monastery in Tibet, the Foling Monastery. And as well as some fragments from Olonsuma in Inner Mongolia. Now, Olonsuma was the capital city of the Ungud, a sedentary Turkic Christian kingdom in what's today Inner Mongolia, south of the Gobi Desert. Those ones, I don't recall the dating on them exactly, but I think they were all printed or based off of the printed Ming era editions, which would put them at 15th century or so. The secret history is an important source, of course, but it is not the extent of the reconstructions, and in a lot of cases, it disagrees with things in other sources, because the secret history is written in a very peculiar way where it wants to condense things into like, so what it will do is it'll have we'll know from other sources a campaign which takes place over like 5 years, and the secret history will condense it all into 1 year or like one single thing. And it does this numerous times because the secret history of the Mongols is reflecting more of a bit more of this oral tradition in the steppe, where that's how you would tell the stories, versus these other works are following more of these traditions set out by historical writers in China or the Middle East, the Islamic world, where they're reusing older documents to come up with the dating systems and things like that. And the secret history doesn't really care about that. It just uses the 12-year animal cycle. So it'll say something like, oh, this happened in the year of the rat, or this happened in the year of the hare. But it'll get confused as to what year that's supposed to be, and it will put something into the wrong year of the rat that we know from another source was actually in 1215, but the secret history just moved it to 1205, and it's a very complicated source to use. And,
though I think one of the encouraging aspects of it, and this is why I was referencing these other copies we had found, is that it seems to be the case, correct me if I'm wrong, but these other copies that we found in disparate places are basically the exact same wording.
Yes. The text as we have it that is appearing in the surviving Mongolian stuff from the like Altan Topchi, from this Ming era work, stuff found in the monastery in Tibet, Olonsuma, the text is pretty much consistent through all of them, except for very minor differences in terms of someone misread something. And like, so for example, in the Altan Topchi tradition in the 17th century, some of the terms in Mongolian were no longer in use, or they didn't know the original places being referred to, so they would change them or they would misread them. And so that would result in some differences in the reading. And there's some sections where the Chinese editions, they didn't understand what was being referred to in the Mongolian, and they used, say, the wrong character, or they translated it wrong. It's not an easy reconstruction to do, and there is well over a century of scholarship working on this and compiling it every time they find new older materials, incorporating that to improve the understanding.
Great. Yeah, let me switch back to the slideshow. I have another painting that we'll go into, but right before then, I wanted to quickly touch on a couple interesting comments here that were on the same subject in a certain way. Was Mongol Bulgoy asks, was the region of Mongolia, both inner and outer, affected by the Black Plague? And then another comment asks, do you find any merit to the claim that the Mongols introduced the Black Death?
Two very good Black Death themed questions. So Black
So this would have
Death,
been 1340s too, so it would be late
yes.
Empire.
So the bacteria that caused the Black Death, the Yersinia pestis, is endemic to Central Asia, which means it naturally occurs there, and it naturally still occurs in Mongolia and parts of Kazakhstan today. And every year, someone eats a marmot and catches it, and then some news program in the United States freaks out, and people on Twitter think the plague's going to come back.
We are not going to be
Don't
engaging
don't let
in.
Don't eat
scare
the
away
marmot.
anyone.
Yeah,
Don't
when
sign
we
up
go in
for
August,
Mongolia.
which you can sign up for with the link in the description.
It's only a
We
small
will not
percentage
eat
you'll die of the
plague-ridden
Black
marmot.
Death.
So, in terms, though, of the actual Black Death and the as in the pandemic of the mid 14th century, it's not clear if it affected Mongolia. Now, this is a very big topic of debate in the scholarship, because right now it looks like the mutation that caused the Yersinia pestis to become the really virulent strain that kills so many millions of people in the world in the 1340s and mid 14th century. This mutation appears to have happened in the early 14th century, and I think they basically dated the outbreak to like the early 1330s, because in eastern Kazakhstan there is a community of Eastern Christian Turkic speakers, and they have a graveyard, and with gravestones, and usually on these gravestones they briefly say the cause of death. And you can see in the 1330s, all of a sudden a lot of people in this community are dying due to plague, up until the community gets abandoned in like the mid 1330s. And what it looks like on most reconstructions is that the plague from there moves west, and of course you have the famous siege of Kaffa in the 1346, I think, where the plague goes from there and then spreads to Constantinople and across the Mediterranean and then across Europe. Now, there is lots of arguments about whether the Mongols were spreading the plague earlier than that in the 13th century, and there was a uh, article recently put out by a historian by the name of Monica Green, who argued that there was plague present at the siege of Baghdad in 1258. But another more recent article by a historian named Yanni Brack has argued no, that this is a misreading of some of the sources on this, and ultimately the problem becomes we get a lot of descriptions of pestilence and plague and sources and stuff, and it's very hard to differentiate between it's just a generic any other sickness, because when armies pass through regions, when you have sieges of many cities, armies, if there's famine is caused, there's so much sickness of um, varying causes that happens as a result of these campaigns, and sources will use very just broad terminology about it, that it's very hard to say definitively this is Black Death, or this is Black Death, or oh no, this is something else. Another argument by a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Pau, has argued that there was a cholera epidemic in southern China in the 1250s, partly a bit of a long story, but partly as a result of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And this cholera epidemic resulted in the death of Mernke during the siege in China in 1259. But he did a lot of very careful work to go, look, here's the kind of symptoms they're describing that seems to line up with cholera. And while we are getting descriptions of sickness and various plagues and things in China in the 14th century, none of it has really been accepted as describing Black Death in particular, or if it is, it was a much less deadly strain than what ended up striking the Middle East, Rus principalities, Golden Horde, Europe, that sort of thing. Now, in terms of the second question here, you find merit to the claim that the Mongols introduced the Black Death. Yes, the trade lines opened by the Mongol Empire seem to have been the primary conduit from which the Black Death spread from Central Asia to Europe. Now, everyone's probably heard the famous story of the siege of Kaffa, where the Mongols are throwing plague bodies into the city. That story is probably not true. There's a whole host of reasons I can explain why it's unlikely, but the chief one is that we get a couple descriptions of this siege, and the one with the plague bodies only occurs in one source, allegedly written by a guy who was in northern Italy at the time of the siege, and the siege was happening in the Crimean Peninsula. And all of his description of the timeline doesn't line up, so it's not really a good. It's not likely for, and there's a bunch of other stuff as well. But what it seems to have happened is after the siege ended, and you have these a peace treaty between Venice and Genoa and the Golden Horde, and the trade ships start leaving from the Golden Horde ports, ferrying grain to Constantinople. And these ships had been held up for a year or two. And we already know there was plague in the Golden Horde at that time. And then the plague rats, whatever, got on these ships. And when these ships finally left after the blockade was lifted, and they reach Constantinople, and then from there, the plague spreads out across the Mediterranean. So the Mongols are indirectly responsible for the introduction of the Black Death to Europe.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is essentially it's a later Mongol empire, and I think it's tempting for people that might not be familiar with the timeline to think that Genghis Khan and the Mongols pushing west were carrying it. But I think it really is more the case that they had sort of connected and opened up the world to have this really consistent form of communication and combat. And in that sort of post-imperial world,
well,
it still is
as
the
well
empire.
with the Golden Horde, this is not very commonly known, but they had a number of cities built in the steppes in what is today southern Russia, between the Caspian and Black Seas. Excuse me. And a number of caravanserai, so these kind of stations for merchants and travelers that stretched across the Ustyurt Plateau in today's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, going into Central Asia. So it seems that this trade infrastructure, intentionally built by the Khans and the Golden Horde in particular, but supported by the other Khanites, that this infrastructure basically served as the highway through which the plague traveled west.
All right. So we talked a lot about the plague. That was awesome.
It's the
This
COVID
was
aftermath. It's in our minds.
This was an interesting painting that we had. So this was depicting a Mongol raid on the Tatars. And so basically the sources for this, and Joe can talk a little bit about his process here, but the sources for this are pretty scant. You have one source that says they get revenge on the Tatars, or they attempt to, and it's kind of hard fought. And they say that they weren't able to fully get revenge until Genghis Khan rises. But there would have been attacks. And then you have another source saying they get revenge on the Jin dynasty. And so this was meant to be the side. It seems probable to me that they probably attacked both of them because they had both participated in the execution of the Mongol Khan. And so some of this comes, we're reconstructing things and saying, well, what is the quality of camp, Tatar camp, that you would attack? You're not attacking a single yurt or ger. So we made a bigger Mongol village. And Joe, yeah, you can talk a little bit about some of the armor that you put in here. What was our thinking here with the Mongols attacking?
Yeah, well, we kind of I wanted to show like a wider variety of armor, and Chris and I agreed that that was probably a good idea. So you see the helmets there. Some of them are wearing kind of metal lamellar armor as well. I made sure to reference Jackmeister's videos. It's very, very helpful. But yeah, I'm surprised. Do you want to show your rendition of this too, Chris? I know Chris did make a version of this, which he.
Oh, let me dig that up, but just keep talking about it. I'll dig it up.
Yeah. So, yeah. So we kind of wanted to show, the different types of armor here. There's some other people to the right as well that are wearing a variety of different armor, like the leather flaps. Is that what you call it, Jack, on the helmet? Is it flaps, or is there a more technical term for that?
There is, and I can't recall what it is at this moment. I know there is a specific Russian term, and it's like bar mitzvah or something. I don't know what a technical term for it would be, but it's the back of the neck kind of.
Yeah, and you can see it here with these three guys as well. Also wanted to show, which we kind of covered in the previous painting with one really heavily armored Mongol and the other one who's really not wearing much armor at all, that you can see here some of these guys are just going, maybe a helmet and a deal robe, and that's how they're entering battle. You see some that are more heavily armored and stuff. So kind of want to show a variety, that it wasn't like, it wasn't a standardized army. It's not like everyone shows up and they get their feathered helmet and their metal lamellar armor. That's like, oh yeah, you're a Mongol now. Here you go. Here's your uniform.
Especially the pre-imperial era.
Yeah, especially pre-imperial, it would have been a bit more ragtag.
Right. Don't have much.
And this is the descriptions we get corroborate this exact, that we have it explicitly said. There's a European description and a Chinese description. The European description says something like only a tenth of the army has like this full like metal armor and stuff, and the Chinese description puts it as like 30% of the army, like basically concentrated in the vanguard, all have this heavier protection and stuff. So it really only seems like a small number of, or a smaller percentage of the army was going to be having above average personal protection. But if you're spending most of the battle out of danger with a bow and arrow and scooching away on your horse, you don't really need the heavier protection as much, because you're not getting in close to where guys can actually stab you.
Yeah, and it would become an obstacle at a certain point if you're trying to be very mobile. So some of these, this was an interesting case. This was the composition I gave Joe. And there's a late Mongol movie coming out that somebody shared in Jackmeister's Discord. And I was like, I love this composition. I would love something like this. And talking to the Mongolian concept artist, I think it's pronounced Burang.
Buran Erdina.
Yeah. He shared some probable reconstructions of basically what a Mongol or steppe encampment might look like. So that would apply to the Tatars as well. And a number of them would have just used some, it sort of makes sense logically, would have used some natural barriers. So if you have a mountain behind you or a hill behind you, use that. The other thing that you see here is carts and wagons around the edge that I had Joe put in. My thinking with some of this, so this I believe is attested to in the sources, that you would have the wagons out in a way, the same way we think of these circle the wagons. You have these carts out that just make it a little bit harder for somebody to raid you.
They made wagon forts. essentially, and it was apparently common enough that the word for this, which I think is like Kuryan, I think. I don't recall exactly, so I forgive if my pronunciation was off there. But it was these wagon forts, and this was how, in the secret history of the Mongols and Rashid ad-Din, it says the uh, pre-imperial armies are basically organized along this line. So you read something like Chinggis Khan shows up to the battle, and he has 13 of these wagon forts. And I guess what we are to take that as is that if they needed to, these were the 13 groups of these extended political or family units, whatever, who could, when the call came, would kind of automatically circle their wagons like this and would know where to put their wagon in the into the fort and stuff, and basically make an impromptu palisade to defend from, and keep the women and children and some animals and possessions inside the fort, while presumably the men or any able-bodied, we know that the women all know how to use bows as well. So if they need to, everyone can get up on the wagons and shoot arrows at people trying to attack them.
Yeah, and then this Ger in the middle here is meant to represent. I think I'm saying this right, Ger Tergin.
Yeah, the Ger wagon, I guess, would be the tent wagon, the home wagon.
Yeah, and basically these become sort of the aristocrats' way of transporting around the steppe. So it seemed like from the sources we get this idea that the 12th century and earlier, you have all of these tents, yurts that are basically always on wheels. And then in this era, sort of leading up to the empire, you have this transition where you might conceive of the commoner tent as being disassembled and assembled as you're moving along the steppe, but you still have these noble tents that are basically almost always on this stage, and it never comes off. And it might make sense if you have a really big Ger, you don't want to disassemble that. You have all your stuff together, and I would guess it conveys a lot of prestige as well. This is from that same Mongolian concept artist. Some great work that he did with a Ger Tergin, sort of a reconstruction from some of the stuff we hear about how they moved and what a nicer, noble Ger would have looked like. Okay, this was the image that we
scene,
opened. Yeah. So a couple interesting things here that I'll mention. And let me swing back because StreamYard doesn't work with all the animations here. But let me swing back to the actual presentation. But basically, we tried to reconstruct. These are these Tatars bringing Ambagai Khan to Zhengdu for his execution. Now, the Tatars are allies with the Jin in this era. And so part of what we tried to show here, is this coming in all right?
Yep.
You see these guys are decked out a lot more than the Mongols in our other works are. And what we're trying to convey there, and I had talked a little bit about this with you, Jack, is that the Tatars, by virtue of being allies with the Jin, would probably have better gear and nicer things because you have that trade with a big sedentary empire.
And this is the descriptions we get as well as Mongols or Chinggis Khan is supposed to be like personally shocked when they attack this Tatar camp. They find like a child wearing like a silk vest and with like a silver nose ring or something, and they're just like flabbergasted at the amount of wealth just a child is wearing in comparison to his own family. And
yeah, and I think
she says similar as well. He has something like one of the famous things they found was silver brocade and like a ladle made of silver or something. So even like a ladle for like scooping soup or something like that, and it was so awe-inspiring that like 100 years after the event, they were still mentioning it.
Yeah, and I think
sources.
that's part of the Jin Empire, Jin Dynasty policy toward the steppe, is that you kind of have a carrot and a stick where you can lure groups to be on your side for a moment because you're essentially not specifically, but you're essentially afraid of a Temujin coming and uniting the whole steppe against you if you are a Chinese dynasty in that era.
It's a very old Chinese tactic, and they see continued through the Ming and Qing dynasties as well, where the idea is it's it's cheaper and easier to basically pay off the nomads rather than to try and send an army out there and fight them in the steppe, where they will just avoid it and then surround it and destroy it. And this is even what causes some of the fighting between the Oirat and the Northern Yuan and the Ming Dynasty, when you have these later attacks from Beijing in like the 16th century, and they're happening because the Ming decided to cut off trade. And when they're building these northern fortifications, things like the Great Wall, or what becomes the Great Wall of China, part of it is to funnel the trade to certain points, and that way you can tax that trade, but you can also control the flow of goods into the steppe, because what the dynasties in North China don't want is they don't want people buying nomadic like horses and livestock and trading them metal and weapons and things that the nomads might use to help better arm themselves for in turn attacking China, and of course preventing this Temujin rising, as you indicated there. So it's an old tactic, and it's usually relatively successful, but when it fails, boy, does it fail dramatically.
So another interesting detail here is this. I believe it's pronounced Kang.
Yeah.
Is sort of this way that you would keep a prisoner, typically on the steppe or in China at the time, but specifically on the steppe during this era, we get a view of that's not this big blocky piece of wood that became the things that we see in photographs like this, but we see these essentially just branches that you would fix around somebody's neck. And so I believe this is Ilkhanate art.
Yes.
And so that's what this is directly referencing, is you have a branch around his neck and you have someone leading him there. He doesn't get, Ambagai doesn't get the courtesy of his own horse here. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so those are the tiny little details that we're trying to inflect these paintings with. I just want to get to a couple of, we've had some questions here that please make a video on the Makvi SOG SOG during the Vietnam War. Yeah, I believe that's sort of the ramp up to the Vietnam War. Yeah, I've wanted to do a Vietnam War one. Thank you for the super chat, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for the super chat.
Really appreciate it. More and more, I want to do some episodes where I could maybe even just talk to people who lived through these events, which is a problem with the Mongol Empire. I can never find anybody who really was around.
In touch with a shaman.
Yeah, yeah, or the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. It's just like we had Timur. Now I haven't found his reincarnation.
Right here,
right? Yeah. But yeah, thank you. I'd like to do some stuff like that. Okay, so we had one question to Jack. Where can we read about
the Great Yasa?
Yeah.
So with the Yasa, there's the Yasa and the Yosun. So the laws and the sayings and customs of Chinggis Khan and the Mongol Empire. Now, famously, Chinggis Khan is supposed to set out a Ikiyasa or Ikijasag, I guess it'd be in Mongolian at the time, and it's so this great sort of codification of laws, and you hear all these things about it, but we don't really know specifically what was in the original laws that Chinggis Khan would have set out. the big issue when you read about the Yasa is that it seems like what the Mongols would do is every time they had a law, like would make a new law, they would say, this is like an ancient law of our people, and would attribute every law going back to Chinggis Khan, even if it had only been in place for a few years. Now, the other problem is we don't have a nice big list of what these laws are until the 15th century from Mamluk Egypt. And you have a famous Mamluk author named al-Makrizi, and this is a guy, he wrote so much. There's more writing surviving from al-Makrizi than you get from most historical states. There's something like, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like there's 200 pieces of al-Makrizi's writing which still survive. And he wrote a lot about the Mongols. And one of the things he wrote was this big summary of what he said was in the Yasa. And when you go online and read about what is in the Yasa of Chinggis Khan, you are almost always just going to see a list of things al-Makrizi listed, but we don't know how far any of that actually dates back. And it seems he's listing off a lot of things that probably originated, like, for example, after the conversion to Islam from the Mongols of the Ilkhanate, because he only really had access to Ilkhanid sources if he had access to any. And we're not sure that he did, because it seems most of what he was using was the writing of earlier Mamluk authors. So I don't know this particular commentary, if he's wants just like a list of the things in there, but if he wants to, he can contact me and I can send him some things to read about what our kind of current understanding of the laws of Chinggis Khan, or the Yasa. You're muted. Sorry, we don't.
Chris, you're muted.
On that note, be sure to check out Jackmeister's channel. I've linked it in the description. I wanted to jump back into some more violent stuff. Prisoner is not violent enough. We got to get into the stuff that gets you demonetized. Okay. This was the painting, basically a raid on, we say in the video that it's the Jin dynasty, but I mentioned that it's probably the frontier. And this is something I'd spoken with Jack about, because they say, look, we get, in retaliation for the killing of Ambagai Khan, we get revenge on the Tatars and the Jin. It didn't seem that plausible to me to sort of have this amazing, massive army apparently got revenge on the Jin, and we never hear about any big battles. We never hear about any city being razed. So it seemed more probable to me that these 13 raids that one of the sources gives were probably smaller raids that are just pillaging on the frontier, and it's technically the Jin dynasty. And then I had reached out to Jack sort of about like, okay, well, who would have lived here? What would these have looked like? You had mentioned some of these people were sedentary. So this was meant to depict a farm. Is it millet that would have been the most common?
Millet is the chief grain grown in Mongolia, both north and south of the Gobi, and in Tibet in this time, because it's a very hardy grain that can survive with relatively little water or kind of maintenance. And we have a lot of sources saying Mongols, most of the time, their main meal is a broth made out of millet, and so there'll be some mutton kind of dropped in there, as well as anything else they can find. We know they liked wolf soup. For example, we have a cookbook from the Yuan dynasty.
It's like something Joe Rogan would promote, like wolf soup or something.
Well, and even better on that note is they don't just give the recipes, they also say the health benefits. So it'll be like increases vitality. So you can basically market it as wolf soup. 14th century Mongols thinking it's going to increase your testosterone.
That's a YouTube short right there. A motivational Mongol diet short.
Have some wolf soup.
Lots of cardamom in all of the dishes, interestingly enough.
Uh,
Yes, so they would have been growing millet. So this frontier region is sort of passing through today's Inner Mongolia, just north of the Yanshan Mountains, I think, northern part of China today. Um, and it's sort of a drier region, but there's agriculture done in the Middle Ages as there is today through this region. And this is the northern border of the Jin Dynasty at the time. Now, everyone's heard of the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall of China, as it exists today, was built largely in the Ming era. So, like, we're talking 1400s, mostly the 1500s, and then through to the 1600s. At this time, there would only be very sporadic border fortifications of like varying centuries in age. So you'd have a section built by one dynasty, mostly out of rammed earth, with a ditch in front of it, and then that would be abandoned at the end of that dynasty. So it'd be like basically a lump on the ground, and then you'd have newer sections which would be refurbished or used for a bit. And most of the people manning these border walls at the time appeared to be these frontier populations who would guard the section which ran through their territory. Now, when people ask, well, how did the Mongols get through the Great Wall of China? Well, there was no Great Wall of China at the time, but the main reason is that these sporadic fortifications, not continuous, they'd run for a couple of kilometers and then there'd be a gap, and there'd be gates and towers and things on them. But most of these border peoples actually submit to Chinggis Khan before he invades China proper. So he's basically just let through the door. Essentially, there's no big battle to go over these walls and things. So when you're having these raids on the Jin northern frontier, they're going for these gaps in these frontier fortifications. And at this point, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of actually maintained Jin northern border fortifications. They seem to largely start in the 1180s and 90s. So at this point, in the narrative, so we're like 1160s, I guess, 1150s, 1160s.
Yeah, that's basically what this is meant to portray,
Yeah.
probably like 1160s.
So there'd basically be no real border defense except for these frontier populations who are lots of Turkic peoples, Ungut, for example, Tangut, who speak a language related to Tibetan. There's Khitans who speak a language related to Mongolian, and it'd be kind of this very diverse, like independent communities who all pay homage to the Jin Emperor. But when the Mongols come and attack, they're probably not getting really any defense. And when the Jin are going on to campaign, they're probably expecting these people to provide a lot of troops and a lot of supplies, millet, for example.
Yeah,
and they're probably expected to do a lot of the dying when the battle actually happens.
So some of the details you'll see here, just the upper left corner, you can kind of make out there's some more Mongol warriors attacking. That was basically supposed to show you have these Mongols that are basically trying to steal herds of livestock, whether it's horses or these other things that would be worth taking if you're raiding a sedentary community. The style of the dwellings here is just sort of like a vaguely contemporary Jin dynasty, which is they have a very similar architecture to the preceding dynasties. So you can see that in the roof. And then that same Kang, those restraints around the neck, we applied to this woman and her child being spared and taken into slavery.
I wondered with this one, were you trying to do kind of a visual reference to your the Khwarezmian invasion video where you had the one guy in his bow shooting at
yeah. Well, I would guess
totally.
the difference here too is that it's you look at those thumbnails, they do look similar. Only this one doesn't get as many views. But this one, I had the idea for Joe is like, okay, well, there is something, if I'm talking about the pre-Empire Mongols, there's something that is less enormous armored battles and sieges and overrunning cities, and you're having a lot more raids like this. Now, when I talked to you and you just basically had said we have this really diverse collection of people on the steppes, but some of the border region at least would have been these Khitan people. And so we have depictions of these Khitan people that I guess would have continued living there because they were part of the Liao dynasty that had fallen at this point of the raids, probably like 35 or 40 years later. So even the hairstyles that you're seeing here and the clothing of our main figure, who's in his final moments, probably. That is based on scrolls and depictions of what we have from the era. I wanted to jump to religion here, the Mongol religion. So, Joe and Jack, if you guys want to talk about, well, Joe, maybe say what you included in this picture, and then Jack, if you can talk a little bit about what we know about shamans and why these details should be here.
Well, yeah, this was actually a really fun painting to do, just because we don't do a lot of paintings where there's just one really big central figure. And then when Chris was telling me it's going to be a shaman, and then gave me all the references from Jack, all the because he's done a couple of shamans among his art. I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. You can really do a lot with this. Just the ominous feel of having the cords draped in front of your head, to have these metallic mirrors on you as a way to ward off any potential spirits or something, and then the kind of the threads coming down from the armor. I thought it could really give a very mysterious, ominous feel, that everything here it's messy and confusing, but it has a very intentional aspect to it. And that's what I really noticed in Jack's work too, that it comes across as very bizarre and very strange, but at the same time you have a feeling that it's this way for a specific reason. There's something going on here. This is a realm imbued with ritual, with significance, with purpose. So yeah, it was really fun to make, and I'm sure Jack could go into a lot of these details here that are painted in.
Now, these descriptions of our Tungusic, Mongolic shamans, these are very old. I think we don't know for sure if in the 13th century they're dressed like this, but I think the oldest dated descriptions of basically this look come from the late 1600s, and they've held relatively consistent since then. So we assume the shamans are dressing very similar in the 13th century, and they are usually understood as being distinctive enough in appearance that people can spot them right away and go, those are the group of the shamans, they're soothsayers, they're divini, whatever the translation they're giving of the word. And the idea with a lot of it is this kind of protective but also transformative elements of the dress. So the face remains covered to protect the eyes, to protect them from being recognized by the spirits they're encountering when they're doing basically exorcisms or traveling through the spirit world. And it protects them from being recognized by evil spirits who might try to track them into the more physical world, but also protects people around them, because the belief is kind of, as you see evil, you kind of absorb some of it, and therefore, if the shamans are kind of locking eyes with people on just normal people, they might accidentally cause evil onto them. And there is descriptions we get where the Mongols are very concerned about people who are like where their eyes are looking, like through when envoys come to speak with the Khans and stuff, where they want them to look in a certain place, where the people are averting their eyes or kind of locking eyes with the Khan. Like it can be like, hey, what are you doing? Are you trying to cast spells or things like that? The mirror in the center there is an element which also helps reflect kind of the gaze or the energy of spirits, and keeps it away from kind of penetrating into the shaman. And there's argument that when you see these elements on some of the armor as well, because these kind of metal discs, I don't know if you can see it there, but you have like the metal disc in the middle of the chest. We see that in a lot of armor, and it would serve to help kind of reinforce the armor, because chest is a major target, but also might be kind of being a bit of a spiritual kind of protection as well. The long kind of bands that hang off, they're supposed to, depending on the custom or the source, are emulating snakes or the wings of a bird, which as the shaman is moving through his dances and the beating of the drum, it'll look like the flapping of the wings, for example. As you said, all of these things are very deliberate and appears to be fairly consistent for the previous few centuries. You don't really get a lot of descriptions of all of these activities for the 13th century, in part probably because they weren't done around outsiders. But we get a lot of descriptions about how shamans are involved in work as physicians. So if someone is ill, shamans get involved to find out if this illness is caused by spirits, and they might provide some remedies. And when they provided a remedy and it failed, Rashid al-Din mentions this is one of the causes for the rivalry between the Mongols and the Tatars in the early 12th century, as a shaman who fails to heal someone who is sick, and the guy's surviving family members hunt down and kill this shaman, and it was a Tatar shaman, and the Tartars get very angry about this, and they want revenge, and that you get this feud that starts because of that. We have they work a lot as astrologers, so the interpreting of natural events, of like meteor showers, of the movement of the stars or other natural phenomenon. They're supposed to interpret these and say if they indicate good or bad omens. And they would burn sheep shoulder blades. And depending on the way that the cracks in the shoulder blades went and the number of cracks in these things, they could read these and give a reading to say if it was the outcome. Like, you'd ask a question like, should we attack these people? And then based on the cracks, the shamans would indicate if they'd been given a positive or a negative reply. And we have a few sources that will say things like, the Mongols called off this campaign because the shamans gave a bad reading. And we have a source that says explicitly the Mongols didn't want to return to attack Europe after 1242 because the shamans were giving bad readings and weren't allowing it. Now, one of the theories I have is that these shaman readings, in terms of whether they should go on with campaigns, were serving a lot as excuses. So if the Mongols wanted to go on campaign and they wanted the troops to feel encouraged, they would tell the troops, hey, the shamans did the readings and they say that the spirits have foretold a positive outcome for this campaign. Therefore, we can go ahead confident, knowing that victory is assured. Or if the Mongols didn't want to go on a campaign because they felt, hey, we are militarily not prepared for this specific task right now, or these guys appear too troublesome, then we will say that there was some kind of divine intervention and the shamans indicated. And we can say, hey, the shamans said no. It's not because we don't have the strength. The shamans said no, we shouldn't do this. So it sort of preserves the integrity of your reputation for your own troops and keeps their morale and confidence up. And interestingly, everyone, Chris and Joe, you did a video on the Mongol invasions of Japan, and you're aware of the kamikaze, the divine wind that pushes the Mongol fleet away from Hakata Bay. Now, do you know the first sources we get describing that? It's not
were they Yuan?
It's coming from the Mongol side.
Wow. Huh.
The Mongols are the ones emphasizing this divine wind, the impact of this fleet, or the impact of these typhoons. And we know they're telling Marco Polo this because this is the version that he's repeating. And they're playing it up that it was this divine intervention stepped in and basically said, no, you can't continue with this. And I think what happened is when they're going back to report to Kublai Khan and tell people, hey, what happened to that fleet? You don't say, well, those Japanese guys put up more resistance than we expected. You say, no, there was this great storm came through and pushed us all the way back to our own empire. It's not because we weren't fighting hard enough or weren't supplied or didn't have enough information. No, divine intervention.
Yeah.
The earliest Japanese sources say nothing. They say, yeah, there was some wind on that last day, but it was mostly like we fought them off and things like that. They say nothing about these typhoons.
Well, at the same time, they might say that too because they have their own bias. You want to beat the Mongols as well. It makes me wonder too if maybe that's where the first invasion, 1274, I believe, the 1274 invasion, there was never any storm because that is sort of debated. But you go back to Kublai and you say there was a storm, and there may have. It seems like there definitely was some sort of adverse weather conditions on the second invasion. I'm
like they have found some of, or what are likely some of the ships from the second invasion in particular. They found them off the coast of Hakata Bay. So probably if there was, and there probably was, storms at the end of this campaign, they kind of play it up and exaggerate them a little bit and go, it's not, it's just because of the storms that we left. If they hadn't been there, we would have gone in there and won. And I think you kind of see a hint of this where Marco Polo's report has something like, yeah, I was told that a section of the army was left behind and was able to go and occupy the Japanese capital for like 60 days or something. And you can kind of get like this indications of how the Mongols were trying to spin it to make themselves look better, because prestige is a very important part to their military reputation. They want everyone to know, if you fight us, you will lose. So when defeats happen, you gotta try and spin them in a way that looks better. And we see, for example, when Rashid ad-Din is describing the Battle of Ain Jalut, so the famous Mongol defeat against the Mamluks in 1260, 1259 or 1260. I always get the dates mixed up.
I'm probably going to defer to you.
I think it's 1260. I always Baghdad, it's 1258. Munka's death is 1259. Ain Jalut is 1260. There we go. That's how I remember it.
Baghdad, yeah, it's 1258.
Yeah. So when Rashid ad-Din is describing the defeat at Ain Jalut, he gives Kitbuka Noyan this heroic speech when he's held by Baibars and Kutus, and Kitbuka's saying, "You can kill me, but Hulagu won't even notice. It'll just be as if his mares stopped foaling for a year. If if the women in his army stopped having kids for a year, we are nothing. We're going to come back next year. We're like, we have so many men. It's like as many grains of sand as there are on the beach."
They have a really can-do attitude.
Yeah, but you have to spin and justify. And the way it looks like Ain Jalut gets spun for the Mongols is that was nothing. That was, they stung our hand, and now we're going to come back later and swipe them. And the way it works, of course, they never really get to do that outside from Wadi al-Haznadar in 1300.
On that same question of the Mongols sort of justifying setbacks or lack of conquest, we have a super chat from Manuman. Thank you so much. You're helping support History Dose. If Batu and his army would have pushed hard to conquer Western Europe, do you think he would have achieved this goal also with hypothetical resupplies from Mongol homelands?
Good question, and a question people have long been arguing over. So my opinion is following an argument put forward by Stephen Pow in his recent doctoral dissertation after many years of research. And I find his findings really convincing. And what it is essentially, when you get the withdrawal from Hungary in 1242, it wasn't because the army was coming back for a Horoltai because of Urgadai Khan's death. It wasn't because they were defeated. It was because they essentially made the calculation, hey, we are winning these battles we are having here, but we're taking a lot of losses here. We've been on campaign for 7+ years at that point. They've traveled all the way across the world. We know they're a bit concerned about uprisings of Kuman Kipchaks in their newly conquered territory. They have to put down a revolt in 12 on the way back, so like 1243. And it looks like they basically make the calculation: we can keep going, we can keep campaigning, but this army is not large enough to properly complete such a conquest, and we don't have enough men to continue this campaign. It would be foolish to kind of throw them away and keep having them ground down. We have to withdraw, come back with more supplies, and come back with a full-size army and properly complete this conquest. One of the papers I'm working on right now is arguing about how the Mongols leave Hungary with a relatively high view of the military capabilities of the Hungarians. Now, don't confuse that. It's not that they think these are the best guys, we can't deal with them. They still thought the Hungarians and the Europeans in general were going to be conquered and were conquerable. We have Guyo Khan himself in 1246 telling a papal envoy, Giovanni di Gian del Carpina, John de Plano Carpina, Guyo Khan is telling him, I'm preparing an army to come back and conquer Europe. So you better tell the Pope and kings of Europe to submit to me unless they want to be destroyed. Like, the Mongols were fully under the expectation they would conquer Europe, and they could conquer Europe, and that Europe was conquerable. However, it required a significant commitment of troops to do that. Just like they needed a significant number of troops to complete the conquest of in China, in the Middle East. Like, they had no problem with campaigns taking longer because they thought they would always be victorious in the end. So it didn't matter if Europe was conquered that year or in 10 years' time, they thought it would happen. Now, the fallout from Urgadai Khan's death prevents an immediate return of Mongol troops. Possibly Guyo Khan had been planning on, or had been in the process of starting this second campaign when he dies in 1248. And then in the reign of Menka Khan in the 1250s, he puts more priority on the campaigns, or on completing the conquests of southern China and the Middle East under his brother Hulagu. And it seems like he was kind of leaving Europe to the end there. Like, all right, we'll get these ones done that we've already got in progress. Then we'll deal with these European guys. And Menka's death in 1259 and the ensuing breakup of the Mongol Empire over the 1260s prevents a proper return in force. You don't see a major follow-up attack on Hungary until the 1280s during the Golden Horde. And my current dissertation research is investigating the causes for this campaign. Basically, the Golden Horde is putting off an attack on Europe because they're trying to defend these immense borders stretching all the way across the world with now antagonistic Mongol states. And Europe is the absolute low priority for them because they know it's going to be a large troop commitment to try and conquer Europe, but they can't pull those troops away and leave their frontiers against the Ilkhanate, Chagatai Khanate, Ulus of Urgadai under Haidu. They can't leave these exposed because all these guys are going to attack the then undefended frontiers of the Golden Horde.
Well, I think that's always the big question mark. My instinct on that is that they had proved themselves against European armies to the extent that you could say, I mean, this is always the big alt history with the Mongols. If they don't break up and you have the full weight of the Mongols and all of their subject peoples, it just seems logically possible that, yes, they could have taken Europe. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there is anything inherently about Europe that prevents it from being conquered compared to the great powers in China or Central Asia or the Middle East at the time. It is just the way that history develops prevents this major campaign from materializing.
Yeah, England would have been harder.
And Jack,
We're not doing no islands. We're not doing islands.
kind of want to backtrack a little bit because I saw some people mention the Huns in the chat here. And I actually have been researching some stuff about the Huns and possible influence on Germanic and Norse culture as well. But I remember seeing the scholar talk about how the Huns also did consult the shoulder blades as well, similar to the Mongols, and that some of the Huns wore an ornate headpiece that was similar to what Mongol shamans wore. So it makes me think, was there direct influence from the Huns on Mongol spirituality, or is Mongol spirituality just preserving something that's incredibly ancient?
I would say the latter rather than the former, because it's many centuries between the Huns and the Mongols. Because when we're discussing this shamanist religion here, these is not something unique to our 13th century Mongols, but rather threads of things across the region, across Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic peoples. I mean, the word shaman comes from a Tungusic language. I forget if Manchu or not, but like these are ancient threads that kind of materialize in different ways over the centuries. But you see this kind of continuity regarding there's Tengri, the sky. There is this kind of quote unquote priestly class, our shamans, who they don't really confer with Tengri so much as it is more of the spirits. It's rather Khans and the kind of elite who are conferring with Tengri or the minor Tengris, these kind of lesser deities in the pantheon. And I would say that these are things kind of passed through various Turkic, Mongolic empires and peoples through time, and in some areas are still practiced. And who did the Huns pick up their aspects from? And it evolves over time, right? It's not static. It's not the exact same belief, but there are certain aspects that show a relative degree of continuity.
So I had just two more paintings I wanted to look at. And then I have a couple fun comments at the end. And if you want to throw some more comments in the chat, feel free, guys. This one, I just really loved digging into some of the details about the daily life of Mongolia, because I had felt like so many of our episodes, by virtue of covering Mongol conquest, you're in different places and you're taking some of the focus away from the Mongols. And so even though I was like, well, I've done however many 7 or 8 episodes on the Mongols, I'm like, I don't really know. Felt like I didn't know much about the Mongols. And so in this case, we were looking at daily life in the pre-imperial times, but these are traditions that sort of endure. And so some of the depictions you see, especially if somebody uses AI, are always like back, like Mongol Empire, and it's like a modern yurt that's pushed back, and it's like made out of canvas and cable ropes or something.
With a wooden door.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things was just chatting with you, Jack. I guess that more recently you discovered that they didn't have the wooden doors in this period.
Yeah, that was new to me, but it turns out we have a few visual depictions of this. There's still peoples in the steppes who use basically hanging fabric as the doorway, but we have lots of descriptions of it. So one of the things the door guards do, who are protecting the door to the ger of Genghis Khan, is they stand on either side of the door, and each of them have one of their feet on this fabric. So it's basically the guards are the physical locks on the door because you can't get it open without pulling it out from underneath their feet. And I just thought it was one of these lovely little details where I'd never thought about it till I um, saw it basically pointed out in a work by Christopher Atwood. And then once I saw it, I looked around in some other place and go, "Oh, this is all over the place. How did I never notice this before?" And it is an important thing where people try to present, or often presents, nomadic and steppe peoples as these groups who are outside of history and unchanging and in perfect continuity with the past. And we'll just look at the modern structure or clothing of the Mongols and say this is how the 13th century people live. And while there are broadly the same, it's still a felt tent. The clothing is still this kind of kaftan tying on the right side. The specific designs are differing. The actual shape of the ger in the 13th century is different than the bit more this flatter, wider one that we have today.
That's what
the current
Joe
one
depicted here. Is
yeah,
more
the
of a
current one
conical.
is kind of more of this military, like one specifically used for military purposes, and the way that it's dissembled, which kind of evolves into the one everyone's using. Whereas at the time, the family ger was this more of this one piece structure that when you load it on the cart, it goes up as one single piece and has things like this felt doorway instead of the wooden doorway they have today, or even the way that the sadel, the way that it ties. The modern one is one that develops, I think, since the 1700s, and kind of goes straight across the chest like this, whereas our medieval ones are tying like down here underneath the armpits.
Yeah, that was one of the things I passed on to Joe, is the way that the robes tied were different between Mongolic and Turkic people, broadly speaking. And so
that's a
when I
very
show the Tatars,
surprisingly
it's a little bit
consistent
different.
description we get is the Mongols tie theirs on the right side and Turks tie it on the left side. And we have Chinese, we have Europeans all describing this. But then sometimes when we find some of these clothing items that survive, like from among Turkic peoples, we see it sometimes ties on like either side. And it seems like everyone knew this except the Turks, almost, kind of in a funny way. But it seems broadly, I don't want to say uniform, but consistent enough that it was kind of the expectation.
Yeah. So this top part of the ger functions as a smoke hole, which could be covered in times of bad weather, rain or something. This is something that is still done in Mongolia today. It's the drying of curds, basically, on the roof, and you're using the sun and the elements to dry out and cure your cheeses. And this is attested to the book from Timothy May, talks about pre-imperial times. They still did this. And so those were tiny little details that I just thought maybe if there's a Mongolian watching, they would say, "Hey, look, I've seen that before," and we'll probably be seeing some of that while we're there. Zainab says, "Tell Jack I said hi." Do you know who this is?
I do.
Okay.
Fact.
Good. I didn't know if it was a random person. Just wanted to say hi.
She's not.
You also get a little hint here in the image of the interior of the ger, which has that lattice structure to kind of support the walls.
Yeah, and so the top of the ger, a lot of times we see like this wooden frame as well, that gives some circular form to it. So this is what.
So good question. The modern Mongolian gers don't have these kind of chimney stacks anymore, but it appears our 12th, 13th century into at least the 15th century have this bit more of this conical appearance, this kind of chimney built into them. And we see this, we have a few Chinese, Islamic, and not just Islamic, but Islamic painters working for Turkic or Mongolian or Ilkhanate successor states, the Jalayirids, for example. And this is broadly how they tend to depict the Gers and Yurts at the time. So it is, and I think another kind of this development of the modern Mongolian gear, as it gets kind of wider, it gets a bit shorter and loses this kind of elevated chimney.
Chris, do you write the scripts yourself? Yes, yes, I do. I actually on this script and a couple of the other Mongol scripts, I would get feedback from Jack and basically just scholarly advice or sometimes just even narrative advice. Beef up this section. This could use a little bit more oomph, or things that sort of were sprinkled into this episode that will become relevant later on in future episodes. So we might want to emphasize those. But yeah, I write
All
the
the
scripts.
writing is Chris's. I only made suggestions that were all optional. Everything you heard was from his fingers and
Yeah, I
voice.
mean, yeah, I just enjoy kind of capturing the ambiance and the vibe of a certain time period. So I write differently based on the subject. You know, there are words or sort of an elevated style that I would use in this video that when I do a mafia video, I'm never saying, you know, I'm not using a lot alas in my Mongol video or my mafia video. I will use it in a Mongol video. Okay, so this was the last painting I wanted to look at. This was just sort of a cool detail. So if you guys have seen the video, you know Temujin's family, after his father dies, is basically abandoned. From what we can gather, it looks like Jack, there seems to be a probable case that it wasn't just them, but we don't know. This is what the sources say. But it seems probable they might have had a servant with them or come across some people that were willing to.
It's kind of one of those things where the written sources, they're always very interested in what happens to the elite people and their servants and slaves. Well, they're not really people in quite the same way, so the narrative doesn't really dwell on them. And it's less dramatic to say, oh, the 2 women and was it six or seven children and 30 servants is less of a dramatic narrative when you want to say about how they were abandoned on the steppe.
They do talk about trying to rally the servants, and then they ditch them in the middle of the night so that they wouldn't notice. I feel like you might wake up if the whole camp's moving. You might go, "Hey, what's going on?"
And sometimes they'll just like drop one in. Well, they'll say when Borta gets kidnapped, and there's just an old woman who's working for them, who's asleep on with like her ear to the ground, and she hears the approaching Merkit raiders, and you go, oh, so evidently they have some amount of servants with them if you know, there's this old lady who's with them to hear these things.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting details that we didn't really show in the video because you can see it a bit in the portraits, but the Bokta, is that a decent pronunciation?
Bokta or Boka, a Boktak, I think, in modern Mongolian.
Yeah, and so this is sort of the headdress. I had seen something too that was similar. I'm trying to, if anybody knows in the chat, what's the name of the sort of classical like Eastern
European princess?
Yeah, what is the name of that? It's like the headpiece that's very tall.
Yeah, the triangular one.
Yeah, exactly.
You know that old Disney cartoon where it's like Robin Hood, but he's like a fox, and
Yeah.
they're like a princess wearing it.
Yeah, that was a Mongol Robin Hood. But
you gotta have a Mongol Disney movie.
Somebody must know what it's called. But anyway, I'd seen something online that suggested that maybe that was of Mongol influence, which would be kind of interesting because we think of it as a very European thing. But, you know, it doesn't necessarily even have to be Mongol. These are sort of steppe traditions, and it's not crazy to think that those sort of travel. But
Jack Weatherford, sorry to interrupt, the Jack Weatherford in his book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, he had the suggestion that this European headdress kind of evolves out of this Mongolian headdress, that they kind of saw it as this high status thing and adopted it, because we do in the Mediterranean, there's a lot more of these kind of Italian Mongol contacts. We lots of Italians working as envoys going back and forth to the Mongol Khanates and acting as translators, working permanently in the Mongol courts, and lots of trade contacts. And maybe something travels through there. I'm not hugely convinced by the argument, because from what I recall reading once something written by, and I don't remember the name, but someone who knew a bit more about the evolution of these headdresses, and I guess the timing doesn't quite.
Henin, it looks
Yeah.
like it's called.
Yeah, I guess the timing doesn't quite line up, but I don't personally know more about that. I've never really looked into it, but the argument is made that it is kind of picked up from the book.
Yeah, in the last piece I wanted to mention from stuff from the video, and I have a couple fun comments, and we'll try to wrap up in a little bit, but I feel like we're flowing. Is Oilun. So you can see in this portrait, she seems very young, like a girl, and I say girl in the video, and that is on purpose, because she's kidnapped by Yesugai in what would be her first marriage. So, Jack, your understanding is she would probably be around 15 or not much older than that at the time, if it's your first marriage.
That's broadly, and that Orta, when she is engaged to Temujin, she is like 12 years old, I think, according to the narrative. But of course, the marriage doesn't take place until a few years after that. But we see from a few other sources, marriages often happening around that kind of 14, 15 age range. Usually the men are a bit older, so we as usual, we get more information for like the birth years of the male members of the family. And we usually see that Mongol princes, their first son is born when they're around 20, with a few exceptions, such as Orgun of the Ilkhanate, who is 12 years old the first time he becomes a father.
So was Temujin kind of a bit exceptional with
He was
being paired off with someone older?
She's only like a year or two older.
Okay. Yeah, she's 1 year, and I remember reading about this, that there was, and I couldn't tell you the source, it might be Timothy May, but talking about the age difference, and it actually was, in some way, we see some other accounts of the first wife of a Mongol typically being a bit older, whether it's 1 or 2 years. And basically the idea is that she's a little bit more experienced. She's quicker to be able to have kids. And that sort of experience would make her a better ally, sort of just in sort of being a someone to counsel them. You know, if you...
This is even more explicit with some examples like Tolui. No, Hulugu, sorry. And Hulugu, his first wife is a lady named Doku's Hatun, who was... the Mongols had a custom where when the man died, his sons or brothers could inherit that man's wives, except for their own mother, of course. So you would have cases where someone like Hulugu would inherit some of the wives of his father, Tolui. And so he might marry a woman who was several years, 10, 15 years older than him, and they're not expected to have children, but she is expected to be like a kind of guiding hand, exactly as you're saying, this person of advice and this kind of unimpeachable standing, who also knows everyone around the guy, all of the members of the bodyguard, all the members of the administration, so she can be a very useful kind of intermediary. And we explicitly have it said by Rashid ad-Din, where he says one of the commands Mernkahan gave to Hulugu was for Hulugu to follow the advice of his wife Doku's Hatun in all matters.
Yeah, no, it's a interesting social dynamic that you sort of have to get used to when studying this. But I have a couple pretty interesting comments here. This was on the one of the top comments on the video. What a nice boy Temujin is in this video. I hope he spreads peace and anti-war when he grows up. One response to that, and I thought this would be an interesting jump off point because you hear this all the time. World's greatest climate activist. It's sort of taken for granted. First, funny joke, but it's taken for granted that the Mongols caused the cooling of the earth by killing so many people. I remember seeing a short that you did on it, and it seems like we can't make that claim so easily. If you could touch on that.
So the way this whole claim emerges, that the Mongols kill so many people that it cools Earth's climate, emerges from an article written in 2005, I think, from in Science Direct, I think, by a researcher named Julia Pongratz, who basically she's measuring ice core samples or something to that effect. I don't recall the specifics right now. I did a video going in much more detail on this, but she makes this claim that the Mongol conquests were both long enough and devastating enough to have that it had a combined effect to have possibly had an impact in the reduction of overall carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I forgive I'm messing up some of the details. I haven't looked at this in over, I think, maybe two or 3 years now. But so she's making this claim based on the statement on two pieces of evidence on the Mongol side, that the Mongols kill, I forget, let's say 60 million people over a period that she counts from, I think, 1206 to 1380, I think is what she says. So when you read that article and don't know anything about the Mongol conquests, you look at that and go, "Oh, so the Mongols are killing tens of millions of people for basically 2 centuries straight." The problem with that is that they aren't. The actual Mongol conquests, depending on where you want to count them from, are starting really in 1210 or 1211 even, when you get this first large invasion of the Jurchen Jin Empire, and continue. We can put it to the middle of the 1280s, because that's about the time you get to the end of the major large-scale warfare. Most of the Mongol warfare that takes place after 1280 is no more larger scale or no more destructive than medieval warfare normally is. And that's because you aren't really getting any of these huge Mongol invasions anymore. You're getting a lot more smaller kind of border skirmishes, smaller armies, a lot more inconclusive, a lot of warfare between other Mongol states where they're fighting in the steppe and there just isn't as much devastation or population loss being caused. And if you reduce the actual Mongol conquest to that length of time, the 70 years, however it ends up to, then following her data, the 70 years of the Mongol conquests are as the same amount of time and similar amount of people killed to the numbers she gives for the Black Death, which she states is too short a period to have caused this drop in atmospheric CO2. And when she is saying all of these deaths are happening from 1206 to say 1400, these are all attributed to the Mongols. Well, the problem is you're basically making everyone who dies in the 14th century caused by the Mongols, and that includes the Black Death, the conquests of Timur, you have Ottoman warfare. I mean, you have the rise of the Ming Dynasty. Like, all of these things we can direct or indirectly say are consequences of the Mongol conquests, but they are not themselves the Mongol conquests or the Mongol invasions proper. And it might seem like kind of a fine distinction to make, but when the argument is hinging on the Mongols kill so many people it cools the climate, and you're including warfare by two Chinese generals in southern China who are fighting each other to be the warlord to succeed the Mongols in China. That's, in my opinion, really hard to include as people or as Mongols killing people cause a cool decline. It might be happening because of the Mongol conquest, but it's not the same as Chinggis Khan ordering 2 million people to be killed in somewhere in Central Asia.
And
So
the
even
Black Plague comes back multiple
Yeah,
times in the
and
1300s.
this is
It's like,
the problem: is that she's the core of the issue with the article. To really summarize it, in case you had trouble following that, is she's basically the author of that article chose the date range in such a specific way to attribute it to being caused by the Mongols. But that requires you really playing around with the data in order to get that reading. Now, there is in the ice cores measured here a certain amount of drop in the atmospheric CO2 or whatever it was. I'd have to relook at it again to get the specifics there. But the data itself, it is a data. It is that reading from the ice cores. The problem is the interpretation of the data and the historical context is basically being incorrectly or even falsely represented in order to get a certain angle out of it. And the issue was then it gets picked up by news sites like the Daily Mail and who spin it into just the simple, the Mongols kill so many people it cools the climate, when the original article, even though I'm saying it's making this kind of incorrect representation, it is still a lot more hesitant in that claim. It is not directly saying that, but it gets reduced to that, and then it becomes this version that we hear so much today.
is there good reason to believe that the rise in or drop in CO2 levels is because of a depopulation of the Earth to begin with?
Well, it's a hard with this kind of data. It's really hard to do a one-to-one that you can kill so many people that reduces enough agriculture that has a global effect on CO2 levels. Because at the same time, over this period, you have what's termed in climate science this kind of shift from the so-called medieval climate anomaly, which is this approximate period of relatively warm temperatures from the I forget now. I want to say like the 8th century to the 12th century, and it starts at the 13th century up until the 1800s is something usually called the Little Ice Age, which is a period of, in general, globally cooler and winter temperatures. And there's billions of things affecting all of this data. You have, for example, in the 1250s, an immense volcanic eruption of the volcano Samalas in today's Indonesia, and this is one of the largest volcanic eruptions of like the last 5,000 years. So this is having an effect on all of these systems, and some of these changes in conditions, they help encourage perhaps the spread of the Black Death. They cause a huge swath of environmental disasters, destruction of cropland from these wetter years, cooler winters, generally. And this is something that's been shown archaeologically, is that the population in Europe leading up to the Black Death, through study of their bones, we can see that this was a population of people who were generally weaker and less healthy as a result of malnutrition in the build up to the Black Death, so that when the Black Death hits, they're even more susceptible, and which is why you see these shocking death rates where 50, 70, 100% of people are killed in some of these regions. So the Mongols are, of course, a part of this, and they are doing things that, like I said earlier, caused the Black Death to be able to travel from Central Asia to Europe. Whether the Mongols themselves are killing so many people that it is causing enough vegetative regrowth to reduce CO2 production or absorb more of the CO2. That, to me, that is harder to say, to really to link up that nicely when you have all of these other things going on at a global scale. And I think, and I know that might sound a bit kind of confusing or hard to wrap your head around, but that's because this is stuff that is hard to wrap your head around, and it's basically imperceptible at an individual level. And we've been accumulating this data for years now through the rigorous scientific study, and more and more and more of it is coming up every single year. But because we're humans, we're kind of dumb. We like really simple narratives that are easy to wrap your head around.
Give me a
And
yes or no.
yeah, it's just you want the yes or no answer. Did the Mongols kill enough people to cool the world? And if I say yes, you go, oh, sounds convincing. And people
Should write
don't
an
need
article.
any more data than that because they already know in their head something about the Mongols killing a lot of people.
It's a cool fact to spit out at parties and stuff
Yeah.
too. So in other words, the Mongols may have played a part, but they were never a sufficient condition for the Earth.
Yeah,
Cool.
it's one of those things where it needs much more data, much more study, much more like analysis than can possibly end
There's
up
no
in a
control.
comment section.
There's no control to say, let's take out the other factors and just consider the Mongol impact or something.
Yeah, you can't isolate it from the other things that we know did happen.
This was an interesting question. So I had this and one other queued up before we log off here. But I do remember reading, I think in like 1241, it was mulled over sending a crusade against the Mongols.
So he asks, why was a crusade never formally called against the Mongols when they invaded Europe? Well, there was. The popes did call a crusade, and the crusading army was put together under the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich II Hohenstaufen, and the son's name, I think, was Conrad. And he puts together an army, and the army meets somewhere in today's Germany. It travels for about 2 weeks, stops near Nuremberg, and then basically the princes, the Germans start fighting each other, to summarize it. These crusades are called, and more crusades are called, and you get the Hungarians trying to get more crusades sent against the Mongols. We have letters from the King of Hungary, Bela IV, where he's complaining that the King of France is able to go on crusade into the Mediterranean, attacking Egypt, the disaster at Mansour in the 1250s, and then his death during the siege of Tunis in the 1270s or so. And he's complaining about, why are you sending these crusades into the Mediterranean when the Mongols are right here? I need the help. And the Pope's going, well, yeah, but the Mongols are attacking you because you've been a sinner, essentially. And it's they do consider it, but it's the same problem whenever there's a crusade. It's just really hard to get people to do what you want them to.
People don't want to fight the Mongols either.
But even before the Mongols are there, it's really hard to get all of these various kings and princes to agree on crusading, just on the target of the crusade. Sometimes they go to Constantinople, and it's hard to go, who's going to be in charge of it, who's funding this thing, who's providing the supplies, and this and that. And it's basically a miracle any of them get off the ground in the first place. And so shorthand, they do call crusade. It does start, and it goes nowhere.
I think one of the interesting things about the Crusades is it's sometimes easy for us in the modern world to try to say, okay, well, what was the cause of it? And it's very simple to always look in sort of a materialist lens and say, well, they must have been doing it for plunder or something. And it's like, well, people would plunder there, and they did want land and power, but we have every reason to believe that they were and especially the foot soldiers and the people calling it were very sincere about their religious reasons for doing it. I wonder if that's the case with the crusade against the Mongols, or whether that's a religious justification slapped on a defensive war, basically.
Well, with this specific, this German crusade that collapses, we know from the sources say about it that its breakup is this very political matter, and there is a defensive aspect. We know there's huge European concerns about who the Mongols are, who they're going to attack next. So we know there's a lot of information going around, and we know the King of Hungary even offers to become a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor if it will help give him more defense. So it's hard for me to separate that there's both defensive and religious aspects of this, because they're also seeing, we see right away, they're trying to explain the Mongols through religious terms. So there's this famous quote from King Louis IX, where he hears about these Tatars and goes, "We're going to send them back to Tartarus." They see them as these people coming out of hell. We see people going, they're trying to explain who the Mongols are using the existing religious language and symbolism that they have. So one of the theories that goes around is that the Mongols are a lost tribe of Israel, and therefore they're in cooperation with the Jews. So therefore we need to launch attacks on the Jews who live in our communities to stop them from cooperating with the Mongols. And they are viewing these attacks on these Jewish people as defensive, because they think it's going to help them against the Mongols. But it's also deeply tied into the religious side of it, because the reason for attacking these Jewish people wouldn't exist without this whole religious component of it.
Yeah, I guess on a similar note, I had a question here. We always hear about how tolerant the Mongol Empire was, especially with regard to religion. How much of this is official policy versus simply the challenges of administering a super large empire?
So this is a very excellent question, and one I've looked at a lot. I did a video on this for Kings and Generals, explaining it, and the summary is people kind of overstate and misrepresent what Mongol religious tolerance looked like. Because what we see is that the Mongols are mainly giving certain tax and other tax exemptions and other privileges to four main religious groups: Taoists, Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians. And these are the only ones who consistently get any sort of official policies of these exemptions. But this is not something present at the start of the empire. This is something that develops during the reign of Ögedei Han from 1229 to 1241. Before that, we see these kind of exemptions being handed out on an individual basis, where the Mongols would see some holy man and decide based on how charismatic, basically, they found him, if he and the people he's representing, his order, if they should receive these privileges and exemptions. Now, the Mongols generally did not ban things on the basis of the religion itself, but they would ban certain practices of the religion that they found themselves incompatible with their beliefs. So we see several times in the empire, they will ban a halal and kosher slaughter of animals, because the Mongol method of slaughter mandates you cannot spill the blood of the animal on the ground, under the belief that this spilt blood is liable to bring bad luck and misfortune upon the empire and the state. But halal slaughter, kosher slaughter, this mandates the draining of all of the animal's blood, so they can't basically coexist. So the Mongols say, hey, you can still be Muslims, you can do all your Muslim things, that's fine with us, as long as you don't kill animals using halal, or you don't slaughter animals in the halal way. Of course, if there's any Muslims in the audience listening to this, they can attest to what that's a major part of the religion, that the animals have to be slaughtered properly in order for them to be consumed by Muslims. And then the Mongols are going, no, you can't eat that on pain of death. And at other times we see them banning things like circumcision, washing of dirty things in running water, a couple other aspects there too. And it's this is the Mongol view, where the religion, they also view religion as any religion that basically has a state attached to it is, in their point of view, legitimate and has earthly power, because if their god is real, he would provide them like physical state power on earth, which means, because there's no states at this time attached to Judaism, or the Mongols aren't interacting with any Hindu states because there's no major Hindu powers in northern India at the time. So we never see, or we see like one or two specific mentions of Jews receiving these tax exemptions. We never see any mentions of Hindus receiving these, or Zoroastrians, or these kind of smaller groups like that, because from the Mongol point of view, if their gods mattered, they would have had a state we would have had to fight.
Do we have a way of, I guess, conceiving of how they may have thought of those other gods, in the sense that the Mongols believe in this divine will, and maybe it is later classified as a monotheistic god, but it sort of is this overarching, I don't know if it's maybe pantheistic, or might be a better explanation of it. But when they are hearing about these other gods and they say, okay, well, the Abrahamic gods seem to have some power, do you think the way that they're conceiving of that is more like a Greek god, where it's not a supreme being, but you have some very powerful spirit on your side that you are misapprehending is God? Or are they thinking your Abrahamic God is actually just Tengri, and you just call
like
him
the
that?
creator of the universe, or
So we have this very interesting quote from Mönche Khan himself. In the 1250s, we have a Franciscan friar, William of Ruruk, who goes to the Mongol imperial capital, Karakorum, and he speaks with Mönche through a translator. And he often complains about how bad his translators are, so we don't know how exact the words are. But he has this kind of interview with Mönche Khan, who's a grandson of Chinggis and Great Khan from 1251 to 1259. And Mönche has a statement that Ruruk reports as, just as there are 5 fingers on the hand, all emanating out from the palm, so too has God given us all these forms of belief. And what it seems to be saying is that, for Mönche at least, the Mongols were perceiving of all these major religions as kind of aspects of Tengri in a way, where they're all true, but they're all at the core basically the same thing. But just like how you have different fingers, these religions they're different parts of it. They're different kind of fragments of this core thing. And the presumption is the Mongols are imagining their version, Tengriism, or Mönche's particular view of it. This is the one true one. But so that's why you don't have to, or you can't really ban the religions themselves, because they're all parts of yours. Now, whether this is a belief that existed prior to the empire or develops over the course of the Mongol Empire, I kind of lean to the later, that the Mongols' view of religion kind of evolves as the empire expands. You kind of have to accommodate more and more of these unknown peoples into their worldview.
Well, and maybe it's also a practicality, not to say that they didn't actually believe what Mönche said, but it's a practicality when your distant relatives who have some land convert to another religion that you still say, oh well, we recognize it's still Tengri, basically.
And we have lots of reports of people saying how they were going to the Mongols and how they were trying to convince this Khan to convert to their religion, and they were totally convinced that Khan was just about to convert to their specific creed. And Rubric actually says this: how the Mongols, the Khans, are doing this on purpose to make everyone kind of like them because they think, oh, he's about to converts to our side.
They didn't say no.
Yeah, he didn't say no, and I think this is probably part of this is where the Mongols are going. We have to show this kind of deference and a certain amount of respect to the religion itself and their god, not necessarily the practices the people are doing, but the actual religion at the heart of it. We have to show a certain degree of deference to that because both there's a practical side. You want these people to be good subjects of the empire, but also at a belief level, they might be thinking this is an aspect of our God, and therefore we have to show him the respect he is due.
So when you see a Mongol convert to, say, Islam or Nestorian Christianity, do you see that? Do you think those Mongols are still conceiving of their conversion as, I'm still broadly worshipping Tengri. I'm still broadly worshipping what I was worshipping before, but now a different version that I think is more true?
Is it like an added revelation on what you had previously believed?
There's probably elements of this. We do see a somewhat later justification when these guys convert to Islam is that they'll say things like Chinggis Khan was a Muslim in all but name, right? He just needed, and then he would be a proper Muslim. He was doing all these other things, and like how they justify to themselves. We also see even these guys will convert. They will still keep visiting shamans, keep taking part in their traditional practices. So they aren't really seeing a separation from the old ways up until they do. Because then starting in the 1300s, we start to get guys converting to Islam like Ghazan Khan in the Ilkhanate, Uzbek in the Golden Horde, where they will have this period after their conversion where they're trying for a short time, maybe a few months or a few years, to really prove their credentials, and they will stamp down on in the Ilkhanate, they stamped down on Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Christian places of worship and communities in their empire, kill a bunch of people, and then after that, step back from that and allow these people back in. So it's almost like, are they searching for like what their belief is? Are they trying to prove to their followers, look, I'm a good Muslim and I'm going to prove it by doing all of these things? And the reality, I think, in most cases is there's no kind of one case fits all where, okay, if a Mongol converts to Islam, he sees it as just another version of Tengri. I think early on we get shades of this because we get guys who are Mongols who are Christians, and we'll get to guys like William Rubruck again, who goes to these guys' courts and goes, he leaves and he goes, that guy wasn't much of a Christian at all. He wasn't doing anything I would call, or I would consider Christianity in his worship, but he's calling himself it, and it's still doing a bunch of Mongol things. So the way I would see it is, is that these guys, these Mongols who convert, they still see themselves as Mongols, but also they consider it, I am a proper Muslim, I'm a proper Christian, I'm a proper Buddhist or whatever. But to them, that means making a show of these certain aspects of faith in a very flexible way that would really that really pisses off anyone who isn't paid by that guy.
Yeah, I would think that one of the biggest areas of conflict for anybody converting, for any of the Mongols converting to Christianity, is that you have, on the one hand, the Mongol belief that power implies divine favor, and then you have the Christian idea that meekness and humility and the downtrodden are the people that are favored by heaven. It's like those are actually polar opposite. That I think would probably be maybe a persistent cause of chafing for someone visiting.
What I'll say is this: is when you have a guy of the same faith as the Khan that he's working for, he says how that guy is the best gosh darn Muslim or Christian or whatever there's ever been. And if you have an outsider who comes to that court and sees him, he goes, "That guy's just doing regular Mongol stuff. He's
Yes,
not. He's an
a
awful.
throne of skulls.
He's. It's the kind of thing where there's always an image aspect to a lot of this, and the guys have to, with the Mongols and then later with Emir Timur, Tamerlane, is they have to walk this line of I can't go too far one way and alienate my power base, but I have to kind of pay homage to these other strands of legitimacy I'm trying to appeal to. So Tamerlane is he's trying to be this image of this great nomadic conqueror, but he's also trying to be a good Muslim, and it doesn't always mesh too neatly if you examine these things objectively. But the really good guys like Tamerlane, they're really good at being each of those things when they need to be.
Okay, so one final question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. What are the most annoying things that appear in fantasy Mongols that irk you?
Anything with Dothraki, anything they do irks me. The fact that the Dothraki get kind of shown as like these stand-ins for Mongols in the media and stuff in a lot of people's imagination, but there's absolutely nothing about the Dothraki that have anything to do with historical nomadic peoples. Down to even the Dothraki, there's a scene where they kill all of the sheep that some people have, and they're looking down on the sheep farmers. But you know who the sheep farmers are in the steppe? It's people like the Mongols. They have tens of thousands of sheep. That's the primary animal they're eating.
Yeah, I always wondered how the Dothraki got food, because they would just go and kill all the pastoralists.
They also don't wear colors, I think.
And their swords are awful things that wouldn't work. There's even one of the battle scenes in the show. They have them like stand on the saddle, like do this weird little crouch thing on the saddles when they shoot. And that would be a very good way to get knocked off your horse in an actual battle. Yeah.
So my last question, this is not an audience question, but my last question is just to zoom out. Why do we like the Mongols? Why do you like the Mongols? Are we all sick individuals for wanting to watch this stuff or learn about it? What's the appeal?
For me, I'm just really interested in what is kind of the practical side of trying to run an empire that is stretching basically all the way across Asia. That is such a complex and fascinating thing. How does a medieval society without our modern conveniences of instant messaging or whatever, how does it handle the problems of them? And sometimes better than you'd expect, and oftentimes much worse than you'd expect. But that's, I find, just an endlessly fascinating thing.
Yeah, I think, and I would guess, maybe you don't want to admit it, but the epicness and the scale of massacre and destruction, there's a certain attraction to that as well. I mean, you're talking about a power that becomes, it's like a who's who they face. You know, all those games that you play in your head about, well, what if samurai face them? What if there's like, yeah, no, they did that. You got to see that, and you got to see how effective they were. I also think the origin of them, and that's kind of what I was trying to portray here, is that in 1150, you wouldn't have looked at the Mongols and said, watch out for those guys. They'll be in Europe soon.
You can make is if a group of ranchers in northern Alberta all of a sudden conquered all of North America, you go, what?
Yeah.
Like at a global scale, that seems crazy. But when you get into the details, you see, how does it happen that just one, how an abandoned boy and his family on the steppe go to establish the largest contiguous empire in history?
And those will be the future episodes. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This was a great conversation. Hope you had some fun,
Yeah.
Jack.
I just want to say too, if you guys, I saw some interesting discussions in here. Really interesting. If you wanna, carry on with those discussions, we do have a Discord now. Not a lot of people know about it, but if you sign up for a Patreon, even if it's just $1, you get access to the Discord. So if you want to carry on those discussions or even just talk to us, we'll be in the Discord and we're able to talk to you guys about it.
And
And
if that's not enough, you can go to Mongolia with us.
yeah, you can also come a little more expensive, but
Link in
and
the
I also
description.
just noticed I'm pretty sure we just broke our live stream length record. I think Jack broke it originally, and then vlogging broke Jack's, and now Jack came back to dethrone him. So next time we have vlogging on, it's probably going to be 3 hours. So we can just keep on doing this.
Good to
Well,
have
the funny thing is, after the last live stream we did with Jack, we had cut it off at like an hour 40, and then I pressed end stream, but we're still on the chat. So it was like, oh, one more question about the Mongols, and then yeah, probably over an hour later we cut it off because I don't know, somebody was becoming malnourished or something.
It was probably like 1 a.m. my time or something.
Yeah. Yes, we do live in Maine, so if the Albertans come, we will be conquered. All right. Well, thank you guys. We will keep an eye out for the
Thank
next
you,
video
guys.
on World War One.
If you haven't left a comment or a like on our latest video, please do that because YouTube's trying to screw us over. So fight back, resist,
Smash the like button.
send the horde.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.